Hi, my name is Ungar-Sargon, and this is my proposition guide for the November 2020 election in California. Stem cells are a special kind of cell that can produce many other kinds of cells and divide indefinitely. There are two kinds of stem cells, embryonic stem cells, which help the body develop in the womb, and adult stem cells, which help replenish high turnover parts of the body like the digestive system, the immune system, and the skin. Stem cells are currently used to treat various cancers of the blood and bone marrow, and researchers believe that they may eventually play a much larger role in treating diseases like Alzheimer's, AIDS, stroke, diabetes, and cancer. The process of obtaining human embryonic stem cells is controversial because it involves the destroying of embryos, which some people consider to be human beings. In 2004, voters in California approved Proposition 71, which added a provision to the state constitution affirming the right of researchers to conduct stem cell research. The measure also created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which provides grants and supports stem cell research. As of June of this year, CIRM has spent most of its Prop 71 funds. Proposition 14 authorizes the state to sell $5.5 billion in bonds to fund additional grants and support the research and development of stem cell treatments for disease. The proposition sets aside $1.5 billion specifically for diseases affecting the brain and central nervous system, and it requires that CIRM spend no more than 7.5% of the bond funds on administrative costs. Every year, Californians pay $65 billion in property taxes. Roughly 60% of these taxes go to cities and counties, while around 40% go to schools and community colleges. Property tax is calculated by multiplying the taxable value of your property by the property tax rate. In 1978, Californians passed Proposition 13, which made it so that the taxable value of land and buildings would be based on their original purchase price as opposed to their market value. Prop 13 limited subsequent adjustment of the original purchase value by putting a 2% annual cap on it, which means that in practice, the taxable value of most land and buildings in California is far less than what the market would dictate because real estate appreciates much faster than 2% annually. Proposition 15 seeks to change the way property tax is calculated for commercial and industrial land and buildings so that it's based on current market values as opposed to the original purchase prices. The proposed change does not apply if the owner in question has less than $3 million of commercial land and buildings. In 1996, Californians passed Proposition 209, which banned consideration of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, public education, and public contracting. This decision eliminated a series of affirmative action policies and programs designed to increase diversity in various institutions. Proposition 16 seeks to repeal Prop 209 and permit government decision-making policies to consider race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public education, public employment, and public contracting. U.S. citizens who are California residents and at least 18 years old can vote in our elections, but this right is denied to people who are either in prison or are currently on parole. At the time of this recording, there are around 50,000 people on state parole in California who are therefore prohibited from voting. Proposition 17 seeks to change the state constitution to allow people who have completed their prison term to vote in our elections. This would also mean that such people could technically run for office, assuming that they hadn't been in prison for either perjury or bribery. In California, we have two elections every even-numbered year. We have a primary in the spring and a general in November. Starting at 17 years of age, a U.S. citizen who resides in California can pre-register to vote, which means that they will be automatically registered when they turn 18. As of June of 2020, there are around 108,000 17-year-olds pre-registered to vote in the state. Proposition 18 would amend the Constitution to allow 17-year-olds who will be 18 at the time of the next general election to vote in any primary or special election that occurs before it. Prop 18 would also, by extension, allow these 17-year-olds to run for elected office. While Proposition 13 made it so that the taxable value of property in California would be calculated based on its purchase price, when property changes hands, its taxable value is adjusted to whatever the current market value is. In practice, this means that if a homeowner chooses to sell their old home and buy a new home, they'll usually be looking at a much higher tax bill. There are, however, special rules that allow existing homeowners to move to a new home without paying the higher rate. This applies if the homeowner is over 55, severely disabled, or is someone whose property has been impacted by natural disaster or contamination. These people can move once within the same county and keep paying their old rate as long as their new home is not more valuable. Proposition 19 would allow homeowners over 55, severely disabled, or whose homes were destroyed by natural disaster to transfer their primary residence's property tax base value to a new residence of any value anywhere in the state up to 3 times. There are 2 basic kinds of crimes in California state law: felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies are divided into the violent variety like murder, robbery, and rape, and the nonviolent variety like selling illegal substances. Misdemeanors are defined as less severe crimes and include things like assault and public drunkenness. There are some crimes, like identity theft, that can be punished either as a felony or as a misdemeanor, and these are known as wobblers. Proposition 20 seeks to add 2 categories of wobblers: serial theft, which applies to any person with 2 or more past convictions stealing something worth more than $250, and organized retail theft, which applies to anyone who steals with others where the stolen value within 180 days exceeds $250. Proposition 20 seeks to require that the state and local enforcement collect DNA from adults who commit misdemeanors of shoplifting, forging checks, and domestic violence. In November of 2016, Californians passed Proposition 57, which changed the state constitution to make prison inmates convicted of nonviolent felonies eligible to be considered for release by the Board of Parole hearings after serving the term for their primary crimes alone. Proposition 20 makes changes to the Prop 57 release consideration process. It excludes inmates convicted of assault and domestic violence from consideration. It requires the board to consider the prisoner's attitudes about their crimes in the decision-making process, and it requires that the prisoners wait 2 years as opposed to 1 before applying for reconsideration. Renters in California pay on average 50% more than their compatriots in the rest of the country. Rent is high here because the state doesn't have enough housing, so the supply is low relative to the demand, and that leads to an expensive market. There are, however, cities that have rent control laws. If you live, for example, in Los Angeles, there are limits on how much a landlord can increase rent from 1 year to the next. A law known as the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act limits local rent control laws in 3 ways. First, rent control can't apply to single-family homes. Second, rent control can't apply to housing built on or after February 1, 1995. And third, rent control laws can't tell landlords what they can charge a new renter when they first move in. Additionally, a new state law limits rent increases for rental housing that's more than 15 years old to 5% plus inflation or 10% annually, whichever is lower. Proposition 21 modifies 3 main limitations of Costa-Hawkins, allowing cities and counties to apply rent control to more properties than is currently allowed. First, cities and counties would be able to apply rent control to all housing that is more than 15 years old, except single-family homes owned by people with 2 or fewer properties. Second, cities and counties would be able to limit how much a landlord can increase rent when a new renter moves in, but they would have to allow landlords to raise rents by up to 15% during the first 3 years. And finally, Prop 21 would enshrine in state law the past court rulings that require rent control to allow landlords a fair rate of return. Rideshare companies that allow you to call a car from your phone or deliver food to your home have exploded over the past 10 years. In total, they're worth about as much as Ford, General Motors, and Fiat Chrysler combined, and most of them are headquartered right here in California. These companies hire their drivers as independent contractors. The drivers choose when, where, and how much to work, use their own vehicles, and they pay their own expenses. Most of these drivers work part-time, and about a third of their working hours are spent waiting and go unpaid. The drivers take home between $11 and $16 an hour. California recently passed a law that limits a company's ability to hire independent contractors, and the state attorney general insists that rideshare companies must therefore treat their drivers as employees. The rideshare companies refuse to comply, and they are currently being sued by the state attorney general. Proposition 22 would make app-based rideshare and delivery drivers independent contractors as opposed to employees. It would also require that rideshare and delivery companies provide the following benefits to their drivers: 120% of the local minimum wage, health insurance stipend for drivers who work more than 15 hours a week, pay for medical expenses and some part of the income lost when a driver gets hurt on the job, and a rest policy that would prohibit a driver from working more than 12 hours in any 24-hour period for the same rideshare company. The kidneys are the organs responsible for filtering blood and producing urine. When a person's kidneys stop functioning, unless they receive a transplant, they need to artificially filter their blood through a process called dialysis multiple times every week to continue living. In California, there are 588 licensed dialysis clinics that treat 80,000 patients each month. Most of these clinics are owned and operated for profit by two companies, DaVita and Fresenius. The majority of people who attend these clinics pay for their dialysis through Medicare. The remaining patients pay through group or individual insurance, and the clinics charge these insurance companies at much higher rates than they charge the government-run insurers. Proposition 23 requires that each dialysis clinic have a doctor on site during all treatment hours. It also requires that each clinic report infection-related information directly to the California Department of Public Health and charges penalties to the clinic if it fails to do so. Prop 23 further requires that dialysis clinics notify and obtain consent from the California Department of Public Health before closing or substantially reducing their services. Finally, Prop 23 prohibits clinics from refusing to provide services to a patient based on how they pay. Consumer data is the biggest industry that you've probably never heard of. As a resource, your data is more precious than gold, and it has enabled Silicon Valley companies to become some of the most profitable firms in the history of capitalism. Your data is harvested in many ways, from analyzing what you buy in grocery stores to tracking you where you go, and much more. Under state law, certain businesses that collect personal data in California must meet consumer data privacy requirements. To qualify for these regulations, the businesses must earn more than $25 million in revenue, buy, sell, or share the personal data of 50,000 people or more, and earn 50% or more of their annual revenue from selling personal data. Proposition 24 seeks to create a new agency called the California Privacy and Protection Agency to oversee and enforce the state's consumer privacy laws. It suggests changes regarding which businesses are required to meet data privacy requirements by increasing the annual threshold to 100,000 or more consumers. This reduces the number of businesses that are required to meet the privacy requirements and focuses these requirements on the larger companies. Prop 24 also creates a new data privacy right that limits the sharing of your personal data, allows for individual consumers a way to correct their data, and even limit its use upon request. Finally, Prop 24 recommends a new penalty of up to $7,500 for violations of the privacy of minors. Under state law, there are two ways in which a person is released from jail before trial: on their own recognizance, meaning trusting their word that they'll show up to the arraignment, or on bail, which means that they pay a sum of money that they agree to forfeit if they don't appear in court. In 2018, the legislature passed SB 10, which eliminates bail and changes the processes for getting released from jail before trial. The law would have gone into effect on October 1, 2019, but it didn't because a referendum on SB 10 qualified for this ballot, so the law is on hold until we vote on it here. Proposition 25 proposes eliminating release from county jail on bail in favor of a new process. It would require an automatic release for most misdemeanor crimes within 12 hours and require that people put in jail for felonies and misdemeanors that are ineligible for automatic release be assessed for their risk of committing a new crime or failing to appear in court. People determined to be at low risk would be released, and those at medium or high risk could still be released, but required to obey certain supervision conditions, such as electronic monitoring. In this new process, state trial courts would be responsible for these pretrial assessments. Once the arraignment happens, people still in prison would generally be released on their own recognizance and not charged fees. A detention hearing could still be requested by the district attorney or the public defender under special circumstances, but the norm would be releasing the accused without fees. So that's it for this video, folks. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And please, please, for the love of all that is good, vote. I am begging you.